Today we're going to take a look at reflexive verbs and how they work in the present tense in Spanish. As always, you can find all of these notes and more at mercyspanish.blogspot.com. So let's go ahead and get started with a look at reflexive verbs. Feel free to follow along with your notes that you've taken in class, or use these notes as you work on homework or practice activities. As we discussed in class, your essential questions for this unit are: why and when are reflexive verbs used? And what are reflexive pronouns and what do they imply? So these essential questions are telling us where we're going and what we want to know or accomplish by the end of this unit. If a verb or sentence is reflexive, that simply means that the person doing the action also receives the action. Or, more simply put, the subject and object of your sentence will be the same. To get a better idea of how reflexive verbs work, let's take a look at an example of a reflexive sentence in English. She is drying her hair. In this sentence, we can see that she is my subject because she is doing the action of drying her hair. And here you can see that is drying or drying is our verb. So she is drying her hair. She is my subject, drying is my verb. So now we have to figure out what part of the sentence her hair would be. Because her hair is receiving the action, we've decided that her hair is the object of this sentence. She is doing the action, and her hair is receiving the action. If you think back to how we initially defined reflexive verbs, you might not think that this is a reflexive sentence, because she doesn't sound like it is equal to her hair, or your subject doesn't sound like it is equal to your object. But if you think of her hair as being a part of herself, you will see that our subject does in fact equal our object. So she is doing the action, but she or herself is also receiving the action. So if you look at this picture, you can get a better idea of how that might look. So again, at first glance, it may be difficult to see that she is equal to her hair. But if you can replace her hair or your object with herself or a reflexive pronoun and your sentence still makes sense, you can then say that your subject does in fact equal your object. So if we can look at this picture and say, she is drying her hair, we can also look at this sentence and say that she is drying herself. And we see that in both sentences, she is doing the action, but she is also receiving the action. In Spanish, reflexive verbs are identified by the pronoun se attached to the infinitive of your verb. That se attached to the infinitive of our verb will later become something that represents our English reflexive pronouns, which are myself, yourself, himself, herself, itself, ourselves, yourselves, and themselves. In Spanish, those reflexive pronouns are me, te, se, nos, os, and se. If you look at these two charts, you can see that me directly relates to myself, te to yourself, se to yourself for usted, which is you formal. Se also relates to himself, herself, and itself. Nos, for nosotros, relates to ourselves. Os relates to yourselves for our informal you all or y'all. Se relates to yourselves for ustedes or you all. And then se relates to themselves for those guys, those girls, or them. So in both Spanish and English sentences, you will have two different pronouns. You will have your subject pronouns that tell us who is doing the action, and your reflexive pronouns that tell us who is receiving the action. So if you think back to the sentence that we had earlier, she is drying her hair does in fact have a subject pronoun and a reflexive pronoun. She is my subject pronoun, and her hair, remember, became herself, and herself is my reflexive pronoun in this sentence. Now that you have all of the pieces, let's put this information together to see how reflexive verbs and reflexive pronouns work in Spanish. We're going to stick with the same example that we've used since the beginning of this presentation. This time it's just written in Spanish. Ella secarse el pelo. And right now it's not conjugated, but loosely translated it will read, she dries herself the hair. And the reason that sounds a little funny to us is because in Spanish, we don't refer to body parts as my hair or my hands. We refer to them as the hair or the hands. And that's really where reflexive pronouns come into play. They tell us specifically who the object is. So we will know by the end of the sentence who that hair or who those hands belong to. In order to conjugate the verb in the sentence, we must follow three specific rules. First, we must find our subject and object. Secondly, we will move and change the se from secarse. And third, we will conjugate the verb. And from previous notes, you should remember that the se will be moved or placed before the conjugated verb, or if you have two verbs in a sentence and your reflexive verb is not conjugated, your se or your reflexive pronoun will be attached to the infinitive. Also from previous notes, you'll remember that we are conjugating these verbs in the present tense for right now. So everything that we've done this year thus far, we're going to continue with these notes by conjugating the verbs in the present tense. You may run into stem changers, you may run into spelling changers, and you may run into some regular verbs. So you have to keep sharp on the knowledge that you've already worked on this year. Now that we've established our three rules for conjugating reflexive verbs, we're ready to tackle this sentence. And we're going to conjugate secarse so that our sentence is grammatically correct and so that we can see that we have used our reflexive pronoun correctly. So let's begin by looking at step 1. We must find our subject and object of the sentence. And here that's going to be pretty easy because we've got a fairly simple sentence. But let's remember that in a statement, our subject comes before the verb, but in a question, our subject will follow the verb. And that's going to be more important for you a little bit later. But right now we can see that here we've got a statement, so our subject will come before the verb. And we can tell that secarse is our verb in this sentence because reflexive verbs are identified by the se attached to the infinitive. And the infinitive here is secar. So here you can see that we've found our subject, and now all we have to do in order to complete step 1 is to find our object. Since secarse is my verb, el pelo must be my object of the sentence. And remember, even though we want it to say her hair, in Spanish it's going to say the hair, or el pelo. And now that we've found the object, we can say that we have successfully completed step 1. Step 2 will require us to move and change the say that is attached to the end of our infinitive. And to make it a little bit easier for us to see which reflexive pronoun we want to choose, I've gone ahead and placed our pronoun chart up here at the top of the page. Since we eventually want this sentence to say that she dries herself the hair, or she dries herself, this say must agree with our object. And since our object is the hair or herself, those two words need to agree. So if we look at our chart up here, we know that me is equal to myself, de is equal to yourself, se is equal to himself, herself, or yourself when referring to stead. So since we see that se here agrees with ella, we don't need to go any further. So we will move this se in front of the conjugated verb so that we can later conjugate the verb. And we have now successfully completed step 2. And the last thing we'll need to do is conjugate the verb. And this is something that should be very familiar to you since we've been working on it since the first day of school. Since secar is a regular verb, you will simply drop the AR and add the present tense AR ending that agrees with ella. And the appropriate ending here would be a, so that your verb becomes seca. And we have now completed the third step and have successfully conjugated the verb secarse as a reflexive. So if you can tell, I've kind of color-coded this for you. Your verb must agree with your subject, and your reflexive pronoun must agree with your object. And remember, your object here is herself or her hair. And those two are the same thing, as you saw earlier in our notes. And our final sentence reads, ella se seca el pelo. She dries herself the hair, or she dries her hair. Again, this is one of those instances where translating directly from Spanish to English is not going to work for you. So for a few more practices in conjugating reflexive verbs, look for the next video on my blog, and that is simply called Conjugating Reflexive Verbs. And if you'd like some more practices, you can check out my blog at mercyspanish.blogspot.com.